When the search was called off and hope began to fade, Ranger, a scarred canine with a haunted past, let out a howl that stopped everyone cold. What he uncovered in the forgotten well wasn't just tragic. It unlocked a secret buried for decades. The sun was just beginning to dip below the ridge when the search party started to pack up. Flashlights flicked on as the shadows crept deeper into the trees, and the radios crackled with tired voices calling it for the night. No sign of the missing boy, Logan Price, 8 years old, last seen 2 days ago riding his bike home from the school bus stop. Search dogs had combed the woods all day. Nothing. Parents were waiting by the barricades, hollow-eyed, holding hands in hope. People wanted to believe Logan had just run off, maybe lost his way, but every hour made that harder. Deputy Tess Morgan had seen these kinds of searches before, the ones that start loud and hopeful and end in heavy silence. She crouched by a tree line, calling softly to her canine partner Ranger, who was sniffing the underbrush. "Anything, boy?" she whispered. Ranger didn't answer, but he froze, his whole body stiff. His ears twitched once, then again. Tess straightened, her pulse quickening. "Ranger?" she called again, a little louder. Then came the sound. A howl, long, deep, and torn from the pit of the dog's chest, ripped through the quiet woods like a knife. It wasn't a bark, not a cry. It was something older, something that felt like grief and warning and urgency all at once. It stopped everyone in their tracks. One of the volunteers dropped their flashlight. A trooper swore under his breath. Tess was already running. She found him near a thick patch of tangled trees, his black coat streaked with dirt, his paws clawing at something half buried beneath vines and leaves. At first, it looked like just a pile of old stones, moss-covered and cracked. Then Tess saw the shape, the ring of rock, the narrow gap that dropped into darkness. A well. "Jesus," she whispered, brushing debris away. The edge was crumbling, but it was clearly a, well, forgotten by time, swallowed by the woods. Ranger growled low, circling the stone ring, pawing at it like he wanted to jump in. "Easy," Tess said, pulling him back gently, but he wouldn't stop. He was shaking now, the muscles under his scarred coat twitching. His nose hovered over the hole. He let out another low howl, this one quieter, almost pleading. The rest of the team caught up. Flashlights lit the area in jittery beams. Sheriff Dalton stepped up beside Tess. "You find something?" he asked. Tess pointed. "It's a well," she said. "And he's losing it." Dalton peered into the opening, then cursed under his breath. "Get the techs over here, now." Someone fetched a rope and a flashlight. They lowered the light slowly into the well, watching the beam disappear into the dark. Then it stopped. Tess leaned in, heart pounding. "What is that?" someone whispered. They brought up the flashlight. Hanging in the rusted old bucket was something small, torn cloth, a child's shoe, and something else, bones. Ranger sat down beside the well, silent now, watching the bucket rise. His ears were forward, his breathing steady. He didn't bark, didn't move. He just waited, as if he had known all along that someone had been down there waiting too. Branches snapped under heavy boots as more deputies arrived at the site, called in by Tess's urgent radio. The air around the well felt colder now, even with the summer heat still clinging to the trees. Ranger didn't move from his spot. He sat beside the stones, muscles tense, eyes locked on the opening like he was waiting for something to crawl out. Tess stood next to him, one hand on his back, grounding him, grounding herself. The sheriff barked orders. "Clear it! Get those vines off! Watch your footing! I don't want anyone falling in!" A group of officers worked quickly, cutting away branches and yanking back weeds that had grown thick and wild over the years. What they uncovered looked ancient. The well's stones were dark with mold and time, some cracked down the middle, others barely holding their shape. Pieces of rotted wood still clung to the rim, what was left of the cover that had once sealed it shut. Someone must have built this back when Dobbins Hollow was just farmland. A tech team lowered a flashlight tied to a rope, their hands steady but eyes wide. Tess crouched at the edge, watching as the light swayed deeper into the dark shaft. She held her breath. Ranger did too. The flashlight touched something, There was a dull thud. It didn't sound like rock or water. "Something's down there," the tech said. He pulled the rope slowly back up. The beam came first, then the edge of the rusted metal bucket, coated in grime and spiderwebs. It groaned against the stone as it rose. Then the smell hit them. It wasn't sharp, not fresh like decay. It was older, deeper, like the earth had been hiding something it didn't want disturbed. Tess turned away for a second, covering her mouth. A few others did too. When the bucket finally reached the top, the contents inside drew everyone still. No one spoke. A small shoe rested at the bottom, its leather warped by time, caked in mud and something darker. Beside it, half covered in wet leaves and dirt, was part of a human jawbone, teeth still attached. The bone looked old, weathered, as if it had been lying there for decades. The tech backed away, shaking his head. "That's not Logan." Tess didn't answer. She was still staring at the shoe. It was small, too small for an 8-year-old boy. The style looked different too, old-fashioned, worn out. She'd seen shoes like that in crime scene photos, but never in real life. Sheriff Dalton leaned in. "That's not from this year. Hell, that's not even from this decade." Tess nodded slowly. "So, what is it?" Nobody answered, but they all knew the same thing. Whatever was pulled up from that well had nothing to do with Logan Price. At least, not yet. Ranger stood up, gave a low whine, and turned his head toward the woods, ears twitching like he was listening for footsteps only he could hear. Tess looked down into the well again, her stomach turning. The bones had waited a long time to be found, and something told her they weren't done speaking. By the next morning, the whole town had heard about the well. News travels fast in small places like Dobbins Hollow. What started as whispers at the diner and quiet phone calls between neighbors turned into full-blown gossip by noon. Everyone had a theory. Everyone remembered something different. And everyone was watching the sheriff's department for answers. Inside the station, Sheriff Dalton sat at his desk, staring at a faded manila folder he hadn't touched in years. The paper was brittle, the ink smudged, but the name written in black marker was still clear. Elsie Greer, age 10, disappeared 1983. The case file was thin, not because people hadn't cared, but because back then things were different. Less technology, fewer resources, and a tendency to explain things away when they didn't fit. They'd searched, yes, combed the woods, asked the neighbors, even brought in a psychic from out of town. But there had never been a body, never a note. After a while, people started saying Elsie must have run off. Maybe to the city. Maybe with someone she trusted. Some folks said she'd had a troubled home life. Others just shook their heads and moved on. But Dalton never forgot. He was only a rookie deputy back then, fresh out of training. He'd helped with the search himself, still remembered the way Elsie's mother had clung to a stuffed bear like it was the only thing keeping her upright. He remembered the girl's school picture too, the one they'd posted all over town. Round face, shy smile, long brown braids. She'd looked like any other little girl, like someone who should have grown up. Now, nearly 4 decades later, it was Ranger who brought her back. The shoe in the bucket was what did it. Dalton had recognized it the second he saw the stitching along the side. He didn't say anything at first, not until he pulled out the old crime scene photos and laid them side by side. It was the same shoe, same size, same color, just worn and swallowed by time. Tess stood across the room, Ranger at her side. "Who is she?" she asked quietly. Dalton sighed. Her name was Elsie Greer. Tess didn't answer right away. She looked down at Ranger, who was watching her like he was waiting, like he already knew. "We're going to need to dig around that well," she said. "Clear out the area. There could be more." Dalton nodded, then looked out the window where the first reporters were already setting up near the edge of the woods. "You think this town's ready for what we're going to find?" "No," Tess said. "But it's time they remembered her." Later that day, an officer delivered the news to Elsie's mother, now living in a small care home on the edge of town. She cried without sound, her hands shaking as she pressed the photo to her chest. "I told them she didn't run away," she whispered. Ranger sat outside the room, still and quiet, ears tilted forward, listening. Before he ever wore a vest or had a badge clipped to his collar, Ranger had a different name. No one knew what it was, and maybe he didn't either. The first time they found him, he was a shadow under a broken trailer in southern Ohio, ribs poking through black fur, one eye swollen shut. The scars on his face were deep, crisscrossed like an old map, and when the officers approached, he didn't growl or bark. He just lay there, watching, too tired to fight, too stubborn to die. He'd come from a dogfighting ring, the kind of place where pain was a business and loyalty was beaten out of you. Most dogs rescued from those places didn't make it. Even fewer could be saved. But there was something in Ranger's eyes that caught someone's attention. A prison rehabilitation program had just launched in the state, pairing inmates with dogs too damaged for adoption, giving both a second chance. Ranger was shipped out in a steel crate, quiet the whole ride, and dropped off at a medium-security prison where a man named Raymond started calling him Ranger. Raymond had done time for armed robbery. Angry, quiet, worn out from the life he used to live. But when he met Ranger, something softened. They didn't trust each other at first. Ranger snapped if anyone touched his food. He hated loud noises. He didn't bark, he watched. Always watching. But Raymond didn't give up. He trained him gently, with patience the dog had never known. Over months, Ranger learned how to sit, stay, track, and alert. He learned how to be brave without being brutal. When Raymond earned early release, he wrote a letter to the canine unit that was scheduled to receive Ranger. In it, he said, "This dog saved me from myself. Don't let anyone tell you he's broken. He's the most loyal soul I've ever met. He just needs someone who won't give up on him." That letter landed in Tess Morgan's hands 2 years later, and she still kept it folded in her jacket pocket. She was a new deputy in Dobbins Hollow, freshly transferred from the city, not much older than 30, smart, steady, and not easily shaken. When she first met Ranger, she'd been warned by the department. "He's not like other nines," they told her. "A little unstable, a little too intense, doesn't do well with crowds, doesn't even like being touched." Tess had crouched down and looked Ranger in the eyes. "Good," she said. "Neither do I." From that day on, they were partners. They trained early in the morning and worked late into the night. Ranger followed no one else. When he was off duty, he didn't play fetch, didn't wag his tail, didn't beg for belly rubs. He wasn't soft, but he was smart, sharp, focused. The town talked. Some folks called him dangerous. Others said he shouldn't be on the force at all. But Tess didn't care. She'd once told the sheriff, "He's the only partner I've got who doesn't lie." And now, standing beside that old well, Ranger had just proved he was something more than a partner. He was a witness. The lab results came back 2 days later. Sheriff Dalton had already guessed what they would say, but hearing it out loud made something inside him tighten. The bones found in the well were human, no question. And the DNA pulled from one of the teeth matched someone still alive, Martha Greer, now 86 years old, and living in a small nursing home just outside Dobbins Hollow. It was official. The girl in the well was Elsie. When Tess heard the news, she didn't say anything at first. She just looked down at Ranger, who was sitting beside her in the station hallway, his head resting on her boot. She reached down and scratched behind his ear, a soft, slow motion. He didn't wag his tail. He just blinked, like he understood. The medical examiner had done more than just confirm the identity. He'd found signs of trauma on the remains, bruising on the ribs, even after all these years, a fracture on the skull. It wasn't an accident. Elsie Greer hadn't fallen into that well. Someone had put her there. And then there was the bracelet. It had been found inside the old, decayed shoe, almost hidden by the mud. A broken charm bracelet with tiny silver pieces still clinging to the chain, one shaped like a book, another like a small angel, and a third shaped like a cross. Tess had cleaned it carefully, taking pictures before sealing it in an evidence bag. It wasn't much, but it was enough for someone to recognize. That someone was Mabel Jenkins, who worked the front desk at the church for over 30 years. I remember that bracelet, she told Tess, her voice shaking. Elsie wore it to Sunday school. Said it was a gift from Pastor Reed. Tess frowned. Reed Leland? Mabel nodded. He gave one just like it to all the children in the youth group. Said it was for being good little lambs. But Elsie's was special. Hers had her name engraved on the back of the cross. They checked. It was still there, barely readable under the grime. E.g., Reed Leland had died 10 years earlier. Heart attack, peaceful in his sleep, buried in the church cemetery, with a headstone that called him a shepherd of souls. For decades he'd been the town's guiding light. He led services, baptized babies, married couples, ran food drives, comforted the grieving. Everyone had trusted him. Everyone had loved him. But now, the girl he'd claimed to love like a daughter had turned up dead, buried in silence, and wearing the gift he gave her. Tess stood in front of the church that evening, the bracelet in her hand, the light fading around her. Ranger stood still at her side, tail low, eyes scanning the shadows near the building. He didn't bark, but when they stepped toward the front doors, he gave a soft growl, low and steady. Tess looked up at the stained glass windows, glowing with the last of the sunlight, and whispered, "What did you see, Elsie?" Because now they had a body, they had a name, and they had a bracelet that told a story no one had been willing to speak. The church in Dobbins Hollow looked the same as it had for the last 60 years. White steeple, brick walls, windows that caught the morning sun just right. The flowers outside were freshly watered, and the bell above the entrance rang every Sunday like clockwork. People came for the sermons, for the community, and because it felt like the one place in town untouched by time or trouble. Pastor Evan Leland stood behind the pulpit that day, finishing a short message about hope during hardship. His voice was calm, confident, the kind that made people lean in and feel seen. He smiled kindly as he shook hands with the last of the congregation, offered prayers, and sent folks home with reminders about the next food drive. No one would have guessed what waited for him just outside the doors. Tess waited in the courtyard, her badge tucked under her jacket, Ranger sitting quietly at her side. She didn't want to cause a scene, but this couldn't wait. When Evan stepped out into the light, his face lit up until he saw her expression. "Deputy Morgan," he said, smoothing his collar. "Something I can help you with." Tess held up the clear evidence bag. Inside was the broken charm bracelet. The silver cross gleamed against the plastic. Evan's eyes locked onto it and stayed there. For a second, his whole body stiffened. "I believe this was found at the bottom of an old well on the edge of town," Tess said. "It belonged to Elsie Greer." He didn't speak. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides. Tess stepped closer, watching him carefully. Ranger hadn't moved, but his eyes were locked on Evan now, his ears twitching. "My father gave these to kids in his Sunday school program," Evan finally said, voice quieter than before. "It was a tradition." "Elsie's was different," Tess said. "Engraved. Personalized." Evan licked his lips. "She was one of the first." "She's dead," Tess said. "Her body was found in a well. Her bracelet was inside her shoe." He looked down, then away. "I didn't know that." "You didn't?" Tess asked. "Or you didn't want to?" That was when Ranger stood up. Evan glanced at the dog, uneasy. "He always look at people like that?" "Only when he doesn't trust them," Tess said. Evan forced a smile, then reached out, maybe to appear calm, maybe to take the evidence bag from her hand. But the moment his fingers brushed the plastic, Ranger let out a deep, sudden growl. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, focused, warning. Evan snatched his hand back like he'd been burned. "Guess your dog doesn't like me." "Ranger's not much for pretending," Tess said. "He reacts to what's real." The silence stretched between them. "I'm sorry about Elsie," Evan said finally. "But if you're suggesting my father had anything to do with her death, you're mistaken. He was a good man. He saved lives." Tess stared at him. "Then, he's the only one who can't answer for it." Evan didn't speak again. He turned back toward the church, slower this time, like the building behind him suddenly felt heavier. Ranger watched him go, not barking, not moving, but growling low in his throat until the doors shut behind him. The night was still and heavy, The kind of night where even the crickets kept quiet. Tess sat on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders, the TV flickering softly in front of her, more for the sound than the show. She hadn't slept well since the discovery at the well, and neither had Ranger. He paced the house like something inside him refused to settle. His nails clicked against the floor, back and forth from window to door, then to the front hallway, where Elsie's bracelet sat, locked in an evidence box. He never whined, never barked, but his body stayed tense, like he was bracing for something only he could sense. By midnight, Tess called softly to him. "Ranger, lie down." He stopped for a moment, looked at her, then slowly lowered himself to the floor near the door. But his ears stayed perked, his chest rising and falling faster than it should have. At 3:12 a.m., Tess woke with a start. The house was too quiet. She sat up and looked toward the living room. Ranger was gone. The back door was cracked open, the wind pushing it gently, just enough to let in the night air. She swore under her breath, grabbed her flashlight, and opened the tracking app on her phone. His collar had a GPS chip, department issued. The dot blinked red on the map, steady and unmoving, sitting at the edge of the woods near the well. She pulled on her boots and grabbed her jacket, heart pounding harder than it should have. The woods looked different at night, darker, tighter, more alive with sounds she didn't trust. But she followed the blinking red light, the grass wet with dew, the trees whispering above her. She found him sitting in the same place as before, beside the old well, body still, eyes forward. His back was to her, but his ears twitched as she stepped close. "Ranger," she said softly, "what are you doing out here?" He didn't move. He didn't turn his head. He just stared down into the black hole in the earth, like it had spoken to him, and he was waiting to hear more. Tess crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. His fur was damp with mist, cold beneath her palm. She followed his gaze into the darkness and saw only shadows and silence. "This can't be it," she whispered. "This can't be where it ends." Ranger finally looked at her, not with fear, not with confusion, with something else, urgency. Then he stood up, turned away from the well, and started walking toward the trees. Not quickly, but steady, each step sure, his nose low, ears shifting as if he were listening to something deep underground. Tess hesitated only a moment before following. She didn't know what he'd find, or how he even knew where to go. But one thing was clear. Ranger wasn't finished, and she was going with him. The night air clung to Tess's skin as she followed Ranger deeper into the woods. He moved like a shadow, silent and focused, his head low, tail stiff, steps careful but quick. There was no trail, no scent she could see, but Ranger clearly had something locked in his mind. His body told her everything she needed to know. He was leading her somewhere important, somewhere forgotten. They pushed past thorny bushes and fallen limbs until the trees began to thin. In the clearing ahead sat an old shed, half collapsed, roof sagging, boards warped with time and rain. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The door hung open, barely attached, and the smell of mildew drifted out like breath from a long-closed tomb. Ranger stopped just outside the entrance. His body was tense, nose pointed at the ground. He began to paw at a patch of dirt near the shed's back wall, scraping aside leaves and gravel, his breathing loud in the quiet. Tess stepped forward and crouched beside him. She brushed away the rest with her hands, fingers trembling slightly. Beneath the debris was a square wooden panel, weathered but solid. A trapdoor. The edges were buried under more gravel, packed in tight. She looked at Ranger. He didn't bark. He just stared at it, as if daring her to open it. Tess reached for the edge and pulled. It stuck at first, like the earth itself didn't want it disturbed. But with one sharp tug and a groan of old hinges, it came free. The hole beneath the door opened like a wound. A wooden ladder dropped into the darkness, the air inside colder than the world above. Tess shone her flashlight down. Dirt walls, thick cobwebs. A narrow tunnel, just big enough for someone to crawl through. She looked at Ranger. He was already moving, slipping down the ladder like he'd done it before. Tess followed, heart hammering. The tunnel stretched forward, low and tight. The wooden supports were rotting, the ceiling damp, but they pressed on. Every few feet, Tess saw pieces of a life long forgotten, torn bits of clothing, a plastic toy truck, a doll with matted hair and one missing eye, crumpled newspapers dated back to the 80s. She scanned the pages, church events, youth group highlights, photos of Reed Leland smiling with neighborhood kids. The deeper they went, the more it felt like the tunnel had been lived in, used over and over again. There was a small table, broken and leaning against the wall, a rusted tin lunchbox, a blanket rolled up in the corner like someone had tried to sleep there. Then Ranger stopped. Tess raised the flashlight and saw it. The wall was covered in scratches, names, dozens of them. Some were neat, carved carefully into the dirt and wood. Others were desperate, barely legible, small handprints stained into the walls. Elsie, Tommy, Grace, Sophie, and one that hadn't faded at all, scratched deeper than the rest. Isaac. Tess stepped back, heart pounding. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a secret someone had buried for years. And now, Ranger had uncovered it. The next morning, the clearing around the old shed was filled with boots and bright yellow tape. The sun hadn't yet broken through the trees, but the forest buzzed with quiet voices and heavy equipment. Forensic teams moved carefully around the trapdoor, one by one slipping into the tunnel below, guided by Tess's flashlight and Ranger's steady presence. Ranger had refused to leave the site. He stood just outside the shed, watching, his eyes following every person who entered as if making sure they treated the place with care. The first call came an hour later. Bones. They'd found another set of remains near the wall of names, tucked under a rotting blanket, a small rib cage, a skull barely larger than a grapefruit. The pathologist on site shook his head slowly. "This one's been here a long time," he murmured. "Maybe 30 years. By noon, they had found 5 sets in total, 5 small bodies hidden in the dark, all lying beneath the church's shadow. Each wrapped in scraps of clothing, some with tiny items beside them, a toy car, a comb, a necklace with a broken clasp. None of the names had matched anyone currently missing. They matched children long ago marked as runaways, cases closed before they were truly open. Elsie hadn't been alone. Tess stood to the side, phone pressed to her ear, giving statements and requesting more units. Her voice stayed even, but her hand trembled just slightly as she reached down to touch Ranger's back. He didn't move, just stood there, quiet and still, watching the truth rise from the dirt. Meanwhile, across town, a reporter named Lucy Hanley had been digging into the past. She worked for a small paper, known for stories about bake sales and football scores, but she had a memory like a steel trap and a distrust of perfect reputations. When the news broke about Elsie and the well, she pulled every article, every photo, every bulletin that mentioned Pastor Reed Leland. There were many. He'd run the youth group for over 20 years, held summer camps, took kids on field trips. His smile was in every town calendar. But Lucy noticed something strange. Some names were repeated again and again, kids praised for their good behavior, their loyalty, their closeness to the pastor. Most had moved away. Some hadn't. She requested access to the church's storage room and attic. With the help of a janitor who still remembered her from Sunday school, she found a dusty trunk tucked behind old choir robes and broken furniture. Inside were envelopes never mailed, letters written by Reed Leland himself. Some were filled with praise for children, others were warnings, notes to parents about needing more control at home, and one letter, never finished, looked more like a confession than anything else. It ended mid-sentence. "They know, I think she told someone." Beneath the letters was a small leather-bound journal. No name on the front, but the handwriting matched. The pages inside were filled with notes, schedules, and beneath all that, fragments of thoughts, guilt, rage, a list of initials and dates. Lucy called Tess immediately. "You're going to want to see this," she said. Back in the woods, Ranger lay down beside the tunnel entrance, his head on his paws, eyes half closed. He'd done what he came to do. He'd remembered the forgotten. The final night of the search was heavy with frustration and dread. The woods had been combed again, every trail walked twice, every creek and shed checked and rechecked. Logan Price had been missing for nearly a week now, and though the discovery of Elsie and the others had shocked the town, there was still one child who hadn't come home. No one wanted to say it out loud, but Tess could feel the mood shifting. People were preparing for bad news. She was walking Ranger through the edge of the schoolyard, just before sunset, more out of routine than hope. The grass was damp, and the sky above was a deep, quiet purple. Most of the search teams had gone home for the night. Only a few stayed behind, checking parking lots and dumpsters, double-checking back doors. Tess was ready to head in when Ranger suddenly pulled hard to the left, yanking the leash tight. "Ranger," she called, trying to steady him, but he was already moving. He dragged her toward a chain-link fence that bordered the rear of the school, right behind the gymnasium. Beyond it was an old, rusted storm drain, half hidden by tall grass and trash blown in from the street. Ranger growled low in his throat, sniffed the edge, then began pawing wildly at the grate. Tess ran up, heart pounding. She knelt beside him and held the flashlight to the drain's opening. It was too dark to see much, just a narrow tunnel stretching beneath the school, lined with mossy concrete and murky water. Then she heard it. A soft, broken whimper. "Logan!" she called, voice shaking. Another sound came back, faint, but real. A child's voice. "Help!" Her hands shook as she reached for the radio. "I've got something. I've got him," she said. "Behind the school, storm drain, he's alive." Within minutes, responders were there, tools in hand, cutting the rusted bolts off the grate. Tess dropped to her stomach and shone the flashlight deep into the tunnel. Ranger stood beside her, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the darkness. When the grate finally popped free, a medic crawled inside and came out minutes later carrying Logan in his arms. The boy was filthy, soaked with cold water, and his lips were cracked from dehydration. His eyes were red, his small hands clinging to the medic's shirt. Tess rushed forward. "Logan, can you hear me?" He nodded, then reached out and touched Ranger's nose. "The dog," he whispered. "He scared him away." Tess blinked. "What do you mean?" "I went behind the church after Sunday school," he said. "A man grabbed me, said I had to come with him, but the dog barked. He was loud. He chased him away. I ran, but I didn't know where to go. I found the drain and hid." Ranger sat beside him, calm now, watching. The medic wrapped Logan in a blanket, and the crowd around them began to cheer softly, some crying, some whispering thanks. But Tess knew the truth. This wasn't just luck. Ranger had remembered the man, his scent, his fear. And once again, he had brought someone home. The interview room at the sheriff's station was cold and quiet. A single light buzzed above the table where Evan Leland sat, hands folded tightly, his eyes darting between the mirrored wall and the door. He looked smaller without the church behind him, without the polished smile or the steady voice of a preacher. Now, he was just a man in a buttoned shirt, with sweat clinging to his collar and a nervous twitch in his jaw. Tess stood on the other side of the glass, arms crossed, listening to Logan's voice on the recorder again. The boy had described everything he could remember. The man had a gold necklace with a small cross, wore dark cologne that smelled like chemicals and spice, and had a slight lisp when he said certain words. He'd told Logan he was taking him somewhere safe, that it was what his father would have wanted. It wasn't just a lead, it was a match. The necklace matched the one Evan wore every Sunday. The cologne was a brand his late father had worn, and Evan still kept in his office. And the lisp, subtle, but it was there. Tess had heard it herself during a sermon. A judge signed the warrant before the hour was over. Now it was time for Ranger. They led Evan into a controlled room for the lineup, 5 men standing in a row, similar height and build. Ranger was already inside, sitting beside Tess, calm but alert. She crouched beside him and whispered, "Let's find the truth." As the men entered, Ranger's eyes scanned them once, twice. Then he stood, stepped forward, and walked directly to number 3. He sat at Evan's feet, stared up, and let out a single, low growl. The room went still. Tess walked in. Evan wouldn't meet her eyes. He was trembling now, hands clenched so tight his knuckles were white. "We have Logan's statement," she said. "We have the necklace, the scent, the tunnel under the church, the journal in your attic, the names on the wall." Evan looked at the floor, silent. "Elsie, Tommy, Grace, Sophie, Isaac," Tess said quietly. "How many more?" His shoulders shook. Ranger growled again. "It was never supposed to be him," Evan whispered, voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hurt Logan. I only followed what my father started. He said the weak had to be protected from themselves, that we were helping them." Tess stared at him, horror twisting in her gut. "You were supposed to be their shepherd." "I was," Evan sobbed, finally looking at her. "Just like my father taught me." Outside the room, Ranger lay down again, his head on his paws, watching the door. He hadn't needed words. He had always known, and now, so did everyone else. The sun was rising slowly over Dobbins Hollow, casting a soft golden light over the trees as if trying to warm a town that had gone cold with truth. The church bell rang once in the distance, sharp against the morning silence. Down by the edge of the woods, Ranger stood alone beside the old stone, his head lowered, nose pressed to the moss-covered rim. Tess found him there just after 6, her boots crunching quietly through the grass. He didn't look up. He didn't move. He just kept his eyes on the stones, like they still held something unsaid. She crouched beside him, running a hand over his back. His fur was damp with morning dew, his body still. "What are you waiting for, boy?" she whispered. "You already gave us everything." But Ranger wasn't done. He moved suddenly, pawing at the outer edge of the well. Not at the opening this time, but the base of the foundation, where the oldest stones met the earth. His claws scraped against one brick, then another, until one shifted beneath his touch. Tess blinked. A loose stone. She reached down, her fingers curling under the edge. It came free, with a soft pull, revealing a narrow hole carved into the wall. Inside was a cloth-wrapped bundle, dry despite the years, sealed with a waxy string. Tess unwrapped it carefully, heart pounding. Inside was a thin leather-bound book, worn but intact. The pages were yellowed, but the handwriting was sharp, clean, and familiar. "Read Leland." She sat down right there in the grass and opened it. The first pages were full of scripture, verses about obedience, silence, purity. Then came lists, names, observations, little notes written in the margins. And then, halfway through, a new tone, less polished, more personal. There was a name. Isaac. He was my first test, my son, my failure. Tess read the lines slowly, the words like ice in her veins. Reed had written about a boy full of questions, who didn't follow the rules, who didn't stay quiet. He had called him defiant. He had said the devil worked through children with open minds. There were no dates, no last name, but the truth was clear. Isaac was Reed's son, and Isaac was the first to disappear. There had never been a missing report, no news article, no funeral, no grave. Just a name scratched into a wall, deeper than all the rest, by a child who must have known he wouldn't be remembered unless he carved himself into the stone. Tess closed the journal, her hands shaking. She looked at Ranger, who had finally laid down beside the well, his body curled gently against the stones, his eyes half closed. For the first time in days, his breathing had slowed. No more pacing, no more growling, just stillness, peace. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. "You knew someone was still waiting." Ranger didn't lift his head. He didn't have to. The last name had been found. And now, the dog who remembered what no one else did could finally rest. If this story moved you, and you want to hear more true-spirited tales of loyalty, mystery, and courage, subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Ranger would appreciate it. So would we.